Everything is. Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Cambridge Union event. Today we have a very fascinating panel taking place with four incredible speakers. The theme of the panel is, does coronavirus mean the end of globalization? So each of the speakers within their own specialisms will give us their accounts. Once they've spoken in turn, I will go through each of them and they will each ask one another questions, and then I'll put forward some questions that students have come up with in Cambridge. And if you're watching live and you have any questions, then just put them down in the live chat or leave them in the comments, and I'll try have a look through and ask them to the speakers. So I hope you enjoy this really exciting event. Please like and subscribe and join us for all of our other Cambridge Union events. So without further ado, we will start and go to the first speaker, who is Professor Ian Goldin. He is a professor of globalization and development and has served as the founding director at the Oxford Martin School. He's the author of 22 books and is also served as the economic advisor to President Mandela. He is a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's a pleasure to talk about whether COVID-19 will spell the end of globalization. And my view is that it will not, but it will transform it dramatically. It will lead to an acceleration of many of the underlying trends. And it would also highlight a number of the trends which we ignored to our peril, and namely that globalization spreads risks as well as opportunities. Globalization is very good. It's lifted more people out of poverty more quickly than any force in history. And by globalization, I mean the movement across national borders of ideas, of technologies, of goods, of services, and of course, of people. And it's that process of opening up and learning more rapidly, which has propelled the world forward over the last 40 years or so. But globalization is also very bad and very ugly. And what we're seeing at the moment with COVID-19 is, of course, these expressions of what I've called in a previous book, the butterfly defect of globalization. Globalization not only connects goods, it connects very bad things too. The super spreaders of the goods are also the super spreaders of the bads. So airport hubs allow us to travel, allow us to see wonderful places and allow commerce across the world. At the same time, they spread pandemics around the world. Cyber centers enable us to have this digital conversation. We would not be here participating in this were it not for digital globalization. And yet they also spread cyber attacks, fake news, and very bad things. And the same is true of financial centers, which spread financial opportunities, give us the access to bank accounts and transfers of money and investments, travel around the world and commerce around the world. The world will not be the same without them, and yet we know they lead to cascading financial crises. So for me, the question is not whether globalization should continue, it's how it continues and how we transform it to become an implementer of the changes we want in the world for a better, fairer world, a cleaner world, where climate change is stopped, where inequality is overcome, and where development is enhanced. But to stop globalization now would be to stop all those things. If we deglobalize, if we get what, say, the president of the US would like, which is to deglobalize the US, if we get that, if we go into a new Cold War where countries are fighting with each other, where we have less flows of ideas, of people, of investment, of trade across national borders, we'll be leading to a dystopian world. We'll be much less able to deal with climate change. We'll be much less able to stop the next pandemic, which could be even worse than this. We'll be much less able to grow the world's economy. And for people who are currently in poverty, the over 2 billion people in the world who are still living under $2 a day, there'll be much less opportunity to escape development. So these are profound questions about how we manage globalization. But I do not believe the answer is in stopping it. I believe it is in harnessing it, in making sure it works for us. Many people say that we've already entered an age of deglobalization. The evidence does not prove this correct. Digital globalization, which is a vital aspect of it, is 10 times the level this year that it was a year ago. Clearly, that is accelerating. And other aspects of globalization are also accelerating. I'm sure that all of you, like me, have been transfixed by the spread of this terrible virus, seeing the maps every day leading to greater amounts of infections and deaths around the world. That's globalization. Not only the spread of the disease, but our ability to follow it, to track it, to have the tools. The scientists around the world who are working in unparalleled ways are another expression of globalization. When I speak to my colleagues across Oxford and say to them, has there been a deglobalization? They will say, as a result of COVID-19, they have much more global collaboration than ever in history. And we hope they do, because we want a vaccine. And when that vaccine is created, we want to be sure that it will be spread around the world and equitably distributed, that we'll have more, not less globalization of vaccines. And when we look at the rightful outpouring of sense of injustice that George Floyd's murder has created, the protests around the world, the Twitter conversations and the conversations in other areas that have traveled around the world. And when you look at the flow of these, you see another aspect of globalization, which is accelerating for the good, which is awareness of the indignities that people suffer, awareness of human rights, awareness of things like racial injustice, and of course, what we saw in the global spread of Me Too movement, gender inequality, and all the other senses of injustices. That's globalization too. And so if we stop globalization, we stop progress around the world. We stop the ability to learn from others and to sense their sense of injustice and to share with them their grief and to share with them the ability to overcome the challenges we face together as humanity. There is no wall high enough that will keep out climate change or a pandemic. But what these high walls do keep out is our ability to share ideas, good ideas and bad ideas, our ability to work together, our ability to share technologies, to share investment, to share trade, to share vaccines, to share surgical masks, and to learn. But what the high walls do keep out, and what they will destroy, is our ability to cooperate. When you go through the different flows of globalization, and I've mentioned digital and I mentioned ideas, to some other flows, it's also clear that these are not stopping. Yes, there is a decline in trade, a dramatic decline in trade in some areas, not in others, like surgical masks, but actually it's amazing how much food our supermarkets still have and how much it's been resilient, supply chains resilience. And that's because what globalization also offers is a choice, multiple choices of different places to get things and different ways to do things. Supply chains had reached their peak, and that's because of technological change, because of customization, because of customers wanting closer proximity, and because of protectionism and nationalism, and that will be accelerated. Financial flows are another aspect of globalization, and I believe those will not be stopped. In fact, we're going to see a massive increase in financial flows, and we're going to have to. I've been calling for a new Marshall Plan. I've been calling for $2.5 trillion of support for developing countries. That's globalization. Official flows from the rich countries to the poor countries to support people in desperate need. And we need other aid too. We want more, not less of that, to flow across our national borders. And there'll be massive increases in financial flows from private sector as well, as assets are repriced around the world, a wave of mergers and acquisitions, and as the center of economic gravity moves to East Asia, because they've handled this so much more effectively, this COVID-19 pandemic. They will exit it quicker and they will continue to grow at stronger rates, and people will want to invest there. So financial flows will not stop, they will change. The trade flows will not stop, they will change. Travel and tourism will come back. and business travel will be permanently, most probably disrupted at lower levels, and that's a good thing because it'll reduce carbon emissions and have other benefits. So I would argue that globalization will not be stopped, it will be transformed. Some of these transformations are for the better, and some of them are for the worse. And what we need to be focused on is not whether to stop globalization or not, but how we harness, amplify the good aspects, like the spread of human rights around the world, like the lifting of people, and how we can help people lift themselves out of poverty, like stopping the next pandemic, where we have to work together. There's one thing COVID-19 has taught us, it's we have to work together much more and empower the international agencies, like the WHO, and that there's no place in the world which cannot be a threat to us, like climate change. So globalization is multidimensional. We need to understand it in that way, and we need to make sure that we build on the positive aspects and constrain and end the butterfly defect of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Goldin. That was a very thoughtful insight. We'll now move on to Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who is a political Marxist economist and commentator, and also a former Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. He taught at the Nehru University in New Delhi from 1974 until his retirement in 2010, and is the author of A Theory of Imperialism and Re-envisioning Socialism. The floor is yours, Professor Patnaik. I think he's muted. He's muted himself. Professor Patnaik, can you hear me? Could you just unmute yourself? Just there at the bottom of your screen. The bottom left. Okay, we can wait until he's figured it out and move on to Will. Will, are you ready to take over just while Professor Patnaik unmutes himself?
Well, I'm happy to do it. I'm going to say something very similar to Ian Goldin. So you might want to wait for Prabhat and just see if he can, just in terms of the texture of your webinar, you might want to hear from him.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful of you. Professor Patnaik, have you figured it out, or should we move on and then come back to you? Okay, I'm trying to read his lips, and I think he's telling us
he needs to go to the bottom. Well, you've told him he needs to go to the bottom left. And the other thing he could do is to kind of log off and dial.
Yeah, all right.
Ah, there he is. Yeah.
There he is. Brilliant.
Okay. Oh, okay. So shall I continue?
Yeah, start from the beginning actually, because we didn't.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. I think a topic like this begs the question, what exactly do we mean by globalization? Typically by globalization, what is generally meant is people coming together, the world becoming smaller, the spread of a cosmopolitan set of values and so on, concern for human rights, etc. And here, globalization's opposite, if you like, is supposed to be nationalism, which, by the way, is very misleading because Gandhi's nationalism or Ho Chi Minh's nationalism is not the same as Hitler's. So that's a misleading way of posing the issue of nationalism. But typically, nationalism is seen as the opposite of globalization. But I would like to look at globalization in a very specific sense, namely, it's a political economy regime under which the world is currently functioning. And that regime is characterized by relatively free flows of commodities and of capital, including, above all, finance. Now, we therefore live in a world in which finance is globalized. It is moving around the globe at an astonishing pace. Huge amounts of it are just making cross-border transfers at an amazing, dizzying pace. But on the other hand, we are a world with nation states. So if you have globalization of finance in a world of nation states, then the nation states government is more or less forced to pursue those kinds of economic policies which global finance wants. Now, this is something which is quite well known. This particular contradiction, for instance, is very well known. John Maynard Keynes had in 1933, in an article which he wrote in Yale Review, had talked about the fact that finance above all must be national. Now, we, however, live in a world in which finance is globalized, and therefore governments willy-nilly, as long as your economy is slotted into this world of kind of, vortex of globalized finance, you are more or less forced to follow the kinds of policies that finance dictates. Now, this, I believe, has now brought capitalism not only to a crisis, even before the pandemic began, but it has brought capitalism to what I would call a sort of Keynes-Roosevelt moment, where even for its own survival, it needs to transcend this particular kind of regime. Now, obviously, if governments, no matter whom you elect, pursue more or less the same policies, because those are the policies dictated by globalized finance, policies that we normally call neoliberal policies, in that case, democracy itself means very little, because you can elect anybody you like, but at least in the realm of the economy, they more or less are doing exactly the same thing. And some of them who in fact come on a promise of doing something different, in fact, immediately after getting elected, exactly follow the same policies as they had promised to fight against. So democracy itself means very little in a world like this. And likewise, for instance, there is a frowning on fiscal deficits, because of which you find that government expenditure on education, health, etc., tends to get curtailed. There's a privatization of essential services. When you have a privatization of essential services, the cost of these services goes up enormously. When it goes up enormously, you find, for instance, in India, the peasants have got into debt because of extremely high healthcare expenditures. And when they get into debt and can't pay back, then large numbers of them commit suicides. Likewise, there's a reduction in welfare expenditures. There's a reduction, as I said, privatization in healthcare and education and other essential services. And what is more, you have these legislations everywhere, again at the behest of globalized finance, which say the fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% of the GDP. Other than the United States, almost every other major country has legislation of this kind, which actually makes government expenditure pro-cyclical rather than anti-cyclical. As a result, governments cannot intervene in times when the level of activity is slowing down. This is something which was actually happening even before the pandemic began. The world economy was slowing down, unemployment was rising, and with the rise in unemployment, there was very little that the governments could do, because each of them was hamstrung by the fact that they could not enlarge the fiscal deficit. If the government wants to increase its level of expenditure in order to stimulate activity in an economy, then ideally it has to finance this expenditure not by taxing workers, who in any case consume the bulk of their incomes, but by taxing either the wealthy or by going for a fiscal deficit, because fiscal deficit means you're not taxing anybody. So either of these are ways of enlarging, and the wealthy save a substantial proportion of their incomes. So either of these are ways of enlarging the overall level of activity, demand in the economy, and therefore activity. Now, therefore, you normally would have expected governments, as they did in the post-Second World War period, to intervene in a manner to bring the level of employment close to full employment and, of course, to stimulate the level of activity. They were not able to do that. Therefore, you have this situation where the kinds of policies that global finance imposes on most of the countries which are slotted into its kind of free flows are policies that are essentially inimical to the interests of the ordinary people. In fact, Ian talked about the reduction in poverty. If you look at nutritional poverty, simply the amount of cereals and food grains which is available per capita in the third world, then you find that the level of nutritional poverty today is much greater than it was in 1980s. You take quinquennial averages, 80 to 85, the per capita was much higher than it is today. As a result, and normally you'd expect when incomes are increasing, when standard of living is increasing, there should be greater nutritional intake, but that's not what is happening. So nutritional poverty in the world is actually increasing, and that's certainly true of India, whose figures I'm very familiar with. In the pre-globalization period, about 58% of the rural Indian population was below a certain calorie norm of 2,200 per day, while today that has gone up to 68%. So you find that, as a matter of fact, the kinds of policies, economic policy that global finance imposes are policies that are really inimical to the interests of the people. Now, this is something which, in a sense, the demands of the emergency that COVID-19 has entailed have made many countries go beyond these constraints. They've been forced to. For instance, in most advanced countries now, you have fiscal deficits far in excess of what is allowed under the regime of globalization. Not so in other countries, not so in India, for instance, because then you are worried that the credit rating agencies would mark you down. There would be an outflow of finance, which there has been from the third world in the last month or so. It has stopped now, but there was a serious outflow. So most countries have broken out of these constraints of a globalized regime, financial regime, but some countries have not, in which case the people are still suffering because of the lockdown. Now, what happens when COVID-19 abates? Now, in a situation like this, there would, of course, be pressure from finance to go back to austerity, to go back to financial orthodoxy. But on the other hand, for most people, it would mean much higher levels of unemployment than before even the pandemic. I'm not talking about the trough of the pandemic. That's obviously something where the unemployment is very high, but even if you come out of that, you would be having much higher levels of unemployment. And therefore, there would be a pressure for getting out of this regime, moving towards a greater welfare state regime, much larger government expenditures, much larger government provision of essential services, much larger government welfare state expenditures, for which there has to be much heavier taxation of the wealthy, and even, if necessary, a larger fiscal deficit. Now, those kinds of changes would not be possible in the current regime of globalization, even after the pandemic is over. To bring about those kinds of changes, which would essentially mean going beyond the hegemony of finance, which would essentially therefore also mean ushering in a new phase, at least immediately in the development of capitalism, which of course can then move on further in political terms. But for doing that, we have to go beyond the existing phase of globalization, the existing regime of globalization. That is not only essential, but to my mind, that is inevitable. I think I better stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, Professor Patnaik. Could I just remind everyone who's watching live, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, we've had a couple come in, please do just leave them in the live chat and Patrick will get them to me. So now we move on to Will. Will Hutton is a political economist and journalist. He is a regular columnist for The Observer and author of 7 books on political economy. He is also the principal of Hertford College, Oxford, and co-chair of the Purposeful Company. Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, when the COVID crisis began, Wuhan was locked down, and in particular, a number of European car companies openly said they were going to have to, and some IT companies in the States, so they're going to have to kind of relocate production, resource, stockpile, they're going to have to diversify. But actually what happened was that the virus moved faster than the parts. And by the time the parts had arrived on container ships to Europe and North America, there was lockdown. And actually it turned out that they found themselves with huge stockpiles of parts from Wuhan and from other parts of the world. And in just the same way that the people who kind of stockpiled toilet paper as individual consumers found that their gardens and their houses were full of toilet paper in the reaction to the pandemic. 3 months later, none of that looks very clever. And I think that, the debate about this has also moved on. I mean, in the 2 weeks, 3 weeks when the pandemic really struck and we began a wave of lockdowns, I mean, there was a real debate about, my God, globalization is coming to a shuddering halt. Onshoring is the new story. Stockpiling is a new story. It's no longer just-in-time production, it's just-in-case production. We've got to have much more resilience. We've got to have our own medical supply industry. We've got our own vaccine industry. The globalization story in which we relied upon interdependencies around the world has basically got to be reversed. And article after article was written challenging the whole notion of globalization. I think now, 3 months on, as we start to, the story is slightly different. It turns out that actually supply chains that were very reliant on interdependency and just story a profound interconnectedness. And I think the debate about globalization has become a kind of much more what Ian Golden said and what Prabhat 2020 it's perfectly possible. The rich got richer. It was enabling enrichment by a tiny minority. And that story is fairly easy. I'm going to defer to Prabhat, obviously, and I mean, Ian quoted them. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I reported earlier this week saying that for the first time since 90s, we're kind of simultaneously declining kind of recessionary impulse from the industrialized countries, and actually the sense that the kind of the slowdown of demand from the kind of richer countries to the emerging economies had actually slowed down. I don't regard it as a great piece of news that 60 emerging economies are stagnating or in recession for the first time simultaneously since 1945. And I do think that the kind of enfranchisement in particular of large parts of Asia and actually Latin America by globalization has on balance been a force for good in the world. And I also think that Western consumers have across the kind of income span kind of really enjoy the choice that globalization has produced. There's been a telling picture of a German supermarket at the beginning of the pandemic that actually wanted to demonstrate the futility of the German government's first round attempt to kind of stop exports of PPE to Italy and close down borders for crucial medical equipment. It pointed out, it cleared it, it said, this is what would be available to you if we actually go national as in Germany. And the supermarket was virtually empty. And I think that and what's been happening, I think, in the last kind of 6 weeks is a much more kind of interesting debate opening up. I think people are, I think that there's and it's particularly true in the European Union. I mean, I'm taken aback by the scale of the, not just the kind of reflationary package that the German government has championed to get the German economy out of the kind of recession. It's an astonishingly expansive package, but more interestingly is its acceptance of an EU recovery plan. The German and French governments are actually doing something which actually in the first fortnight of the lockdown seemed impossible. In fact, the bien-pensant commentators and Eurosceptic commentators, right-wing commentators in Britain and America, were actually writing the last rites of the European project. It was all over. Europe was going to fall apart. The euro was finished. The Germans weren't going to work with the French in underwriting European recovery. The EU, as a project of international collaboration, was dead as a dodo. And well, I remember, the kind of leading kind of intellectual lights of Brexit Toryism coming on Newsnight and writing op-eds in our newspapers, kind of delighting in the end of the European Union. You wouldn't say that now. Because actually what's happened is that actually the pandemic has made people recognize their interdependencies, that actually they don't want to leave a world behind in which kind of everything comes from everywhere, that actually there is economic interdependence and it has to be managed. I think it's also interesting that actually, although the World Trade Organization is in very considerable difficulty, the campaign to find someone to run it now that the directorship is vacant, is actually intense. I don't think, I think one has to kind of unpick a bit, what we think is good and bad about globalization, and what we think COVID is actually doing. See, I don't think that COVID-19 is actually going to threaten kind of the kind of mainstream of globalization. And here I strongly disagree this is one area I disagree very strongly with Prabhat. I mean, for me, the story of economic growth, wealth generation, and actually civilization itself over the millennia has been about trade. Trade and the exchange of goods, services, and ideas, and the openness that goes with it is what drives what drives civilizational growth. One of the reasons why the early civilizations were all around the Mediterranean was because you could trade so freely, as the great historian Braudel has documented. Western Europe built its preeminence again on access to Atlantic trade routes. The trade, actually, there is no growth without trade. And ultimately, I mean, I strongly agree with people who say that the only that we need to kind of be less fixated with the metric that GDP growth is the only source of kind of well-being. It's plainly a bigger story than just GDP growth. But actually, innovation, the harnessing of great technologies, the doing things more effectively, the kind of capacity to kind of, as human beings, to kind of deliver the Aristotelian promise of what does it mean to live well, to actually to do things with your head, with your hands, to use the gifts that God has given you to make the world a little bit better. You do that better in a context of openness rather than closure. And to the extent that globalization was always about openness rather than closure, is the extent to which we must hold on to it fast and not delight in actually jumping on it or trying to kill it. But here, having said that, I think COVID has opened up another debate, which is as profound, and which in a sense is the dark side of the last 10 or 15 years. And that is actually the phenomenal kind of inequities of the world that actually globalization facilitated, but not necessarily kind of indubitably caused. I mean, there were possibilities open to national governments to ameliorate the bad effect of globalization, or even lean against it more than they did not do. I mean, there were choices which weren't taken. But willy-nilly, we find ourselves in June 2020, with this extraordinary moment where the Black Lives Matter movement has had not just resonance in the United States, but international resonance. And one of the reasons why it's an international resonance and why it's not going to go away is because of a kind of the obviousness that actually overladen all the other inequities of race, that actually COVID has actually disproportionately hit BAME communities kind of across the West, and is now going to hit them hardest in the emerging economies. And I think that the debate about what to do about inequity, about in all its manifestations, by the way, has become extraordinarily alive. And I think the debate shouldn't be about we've got to end globalization, we've got to return to a world of autarky. The debate should be, we have to manage this phenomena, this hugely beneficial phenomena potentially, and which has, notwithstanding the fact that it wasn't managed very well, still delivered much good. We have to manage this much better. We have to have better institutions to manage trade, to manage finance, to manage the oceans, to manage cyberspace, to manage space. All of that has to be done much, much better. We need, and of course, and overwhelmingly, health. But simultaneously, we have to recognize that actually the kind of inequities that actually have been put up with and kind of accepted over the last kind of 15, 20, 25 years are completely unacceptable, and actually are kind of mortal threat to the way we live. So for me, the kind of, what you've got your 4 or 5 speakers to talk about this evening, can globalization survive COVID? What kind of threat does COVID kind of mount to globalization? It's kind of only part of it. I think that globalization, in the way I've tried to define it, is a must-have. The interdependencies that have been produced by it must be retained, that the possibilities that it opens up are ones we must seize. But actually what the virus has demonstrated is that fundamental inequity kind of is as much of a pandemic and as much as a threat, and which must be contested as ever. So that's what I have to say, really. I mean, I've said my say, so thank you very much for bearing with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Will. Very informative. I'm learning so much. Now move on to Dr. Linda Yueh, who is a fellow in economics at St. Edmund Hall, Oxford University, and adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School. She's also the visiting professor at LSE and the author of The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today, which was one of the Times' best business books of the year. Dr. Yueh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's already been a wonderful debate. And I think for my part, it's going to be hard not to repeat some of the really fascinating things that have already been said. So I think I'm going to just try and maybe answer the question as to how COVID-19 or coronavirus, what it means for globalization. So I think I'm going to focus on the ways in which it's worsened one of the major geoeconomic tensions that already exists. I'm then going to talk a bit about a major trend, the new global middle class that COVID might be stalling. And then I'm going to finish on some of the globalization trends that I think COVID is actually accelerating. And maybe that will just open up us to a discussion around what some of the opportunities and downsides of the globalization trends that we're already experiencing might be once they're accelerated or stalled by COVID-19. So again, I think I'm going to start with the ways in which I think there's been a lot of trends in the global economy before the pandemic. And I think the one that I'm going to focus a bit on is the geoeconomic tension. In fact, geoeconomics as a term has now become a more popularly used term. And I don't think that's a good thing, because it just means that there's much more geopolitical as well as economic factors or tensions in the world economy. So the one I'm thinking of is the one that all of you are immediately thinking of, which is the US-China tension. And I describe it as a tension because I think it's deeper than a trade war. I think it is about much broader power. So it's about a lot of things. But I think what COVID-19 has done is that it has worsened some of those tensions. And Will mentioned supply chains. And supply chains is an area where the backlash against China and its handling of COVID-19 and some of the tensions we see with the United States has meant that what was already taking form as what I've described as a balkanization of the global system, it's just becoming slightly more balkanized. So in other words, what you have now is a discussion. I'm just going to use supply chains because we can talk about investment, we can talk about tariffs, we can talk about a range of things. But COVID-19 has pointed to supply chain. So actually, I think the best way for me to describe it is to quote Richard Baldwin, the trade economist, who says, you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket, regardless of who that country is, including your own. So what he's really pointing to is something that I've looked at in my recent work as well as in my book, The Great Economist, because supply chain trends, as I say, this has been going on for some time, which is essentially what you have now is a pandemic that's hit all top of the 10 manufacturing countries at once. So regardless of how great you are at diversification, you probably weren't going to avoid this pandemic. However, what it has highlighted is what happens when that happens. And I think this is partly that discussion. So right now, there's a much greater focus on whether or not supply chain resilience needs to be considered in the context of medical needs, national security. So again, this is just an ongoing trend. So once you start to think about supply chains in this sort of way, being involved in overall policy, needing to have resilience, diversification, even though, as I've just stressed, it's very difficult, it's adding to the tensions that we'd already seen when the US-China trade wars meant companies had to think about tariffs, they had to think about investment restrictions, which could affect the way that they operate. So the kind of commercial openness that we want as part of globalization, that has already been changed by geoeconomic tensions. And I think COVID adds another layer to it. But the national security, I suppose, overlay onto supply chains, that was going to happen. But now I think COVID has added another layer to it. So I think this tension, this geoeconomic tension, to me is something that COVID has worsened. Now, the trend that I think, unfortunately, COVID might have stalled a bit is around the new global middle class. So we've had an extraordinary period of poverty reduction. All of you will know it very well, including those of you, who are watching, because the Millennium Development Goals, which was to halve extreme poverty in the world from 1990 levels by 2015, was actually reached 5 years early. Now, the remaining 700 million or so people who live in extreme poverty, That's part of the UN Sustainable Development Goal of eradicating extreme poverty. So those who live on less than $1.90 per day, adjusted for what a dollar buys in their country. Now, the World Bank report that we'll refer to suggested that we could have an increase in extreme poverty as a result of COVID. And that, to me, is something which is extremely worrying. And I think Prabhat's hit that point very well as well. So I think on this trend of, bringing extreme poverty down to about 10% of the world's population, this explosion of literally about hundreds of millions, if not more people who have joined the middle class, that trend, I'm afraid, is likely to take a hit because of this incredible economic damage that we're living through right now. So then I'm sure we'll come back to that. So I think the last bit, which is the trends that I think COVID is actually accelerating in globalization, are again trends that we have seen throughout the 21st century. And these are the kinds of trends that was already reshaping the global economy, again, before COVID. So these are the trends around digitalization, digital trade, data, e-commerce, services. These are all areas that was beginning to reshape the global economy. And so I know when we talk about trade, we always end up talking about tariffs, but of course, that's only one part of global trade. The services trade, for instance, are a smaller part of global trade, but it has been consistently growing, whereas trade in manufacturing and commodities has actually not grown as quickly. So how is COVID accelerating these trends? Well, I think this is an example. So the use of digital transmission of information, the rise of e-commerce, online shopping. When you're locked down, you don't have, this is provided you can actually get a delivery spot, of course. But this growth of digital e-commerce data, this trend has been accelerated by COVID, including companies realizing they can actually manage remote working. So it's really, I think, accelerated what some of these globalization trends are. So, today, Prabhat is in India, and this kind of cross-border communication is, I think, going to be, we're going to see much more of this. So this raises other issues. So there's lots of issues here, and I think, Ian, Will, and Prabhat have already touched on a number of them. But I'm going to focus on one of the areas, which is inequality, which is something that we've already started to discuss. So the economic studies show that this trend, you can connect anyone, you can work remotely. Well, it only works if you have access to technology. The correlation between the ability to be productive in remote working is correlated with highly skilled, higher income, and better paid occupations and industries. So this is going to worsen inequality, which is one of the big issues of our time. So this trend itself already suggests you need to think about policies to support, and I'm not just talking about, we already know there are people who struggle. We know there are people who are left behind by globalization. This trend is going to accelerate that trend, plus the hollowing out of the middle class, the mid-skilled jobs. So what skill buys technical change, which has been with us for some time, has done, is that it's actually essentially hit the middle class, middle income people hardest in advanced economies. It's different for emerging economies. So I think COVID is going to accelerate that trend, which means that we do need to think hard about policies on a global scale, because I think this is going to be with us for some time, social distancing. But just to finish on a slightly more optimistic note, I think one of the things about globalization through history is that it goes through it goes through phases. So in my book, The Great Economist, I look at 250 years of economic history. And we have been in periods in which there's been this massive backlash against globalization, against the economic system, because of inequality, those who are left behind. Every episode is different, but what they share in common is it generates a need to talk about how you can reform the current system, or whether or not you should be rejecting it and looking for a new one. And it's a good debate to have. And I think what COVID has done is that it has worsened some of the trends that we've seen. It's stalled some good progress in the global system, but it's also offered up opportunities. But with those opportunities around digital trade and not seeing borders when you do something like this, or when we provide education or when there's telemedicine, it still means that there's another range of issues around inequality that needs to be looked at as well, for it to really be an opportunity that we should be pursuing. So I'll pause there, but I think this is the right discussion to be having at an opportune time. So I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Yueh, for those very fascinating comments, and for also bringing some new stuff for us to work with. Because now we move on to the conversation part of the panel, where each of you will have the opportunity to ask another panel, or you can just ask an open question to the other panelists, just something that you're curious about, something that another person said that's interested you or that you've disagreed with. Now's the opportunity to ask. So unless anyone has a question already, should we go in the same order that we did with the speeches? So Professor Golden, if you have just an open question or any question for another panelist, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure hearing Prabhat, Will, and Linda. And I agree with many of the things, and we need to reconcile them. And I reconcile them by saying, well, globalization is good, bad, and ugly. We need to amplify the goods and stop the bads and absolutely kill the ugly side, like fake news, like trade in slavery, like the inequalities we're seeing and the racism we're seeing around the world. I guess my questions are really threefold. Firstly, to Prabhat, I absolutely agree that that finance unfettered has been deeply corrupt, and not least in the US, where the revolving door between Wall Street and the White House could not be more obvious, and where one needs $1 billion to become the president, $10 million to become a congressperson, simply in campaign contributions. And of course, the amount of lobbying spend, billions of dollars of lobbying spend. Having said that, there are many examples, and this really touches on a point that Will has said, there are many examples around the world of governments taking policy decisions which effectively manage globalization. Perhaps the most obvious one is China. No one could say that it is the patsy of international finance. No one could say that China has not been able to shape globalization in its own mold. At the same time, I would argue it has been the biggest beneficiary of globalization by far, because it has very strong policies. But it's not only massive countries like China. Vietnam's another example. And even within Europe, when you look at the huge distinctions between countries, compare Denmark with the United Kingdom, for example, in terms of the Gini coefficients, inequalities, unemployment levels, the ability of people to exercise rights of various kinds. So even within countries, even within a very similar framework like Europe, we see these vast differences. And I would argue in the end that comes down to the ability of governments to manage globalization on behalf of their citizens, or maybe to abuse their citizens. And Will also touched on very bad governments, which basically abuse globalization by creating tax havens. No, they're not bad. I mean, their citizens are extremely rich often, but clearly it's bad for the system. And that's why we need international governments. The one thing that isn't globalized at all is governance. politics has become more fragmented. There's 100 new countries in the world over the last 100 years, 50 or something over the last 50 years. And we see the complete reversal of power. The group that's been missing in action in COVID-19 and collaborate, that there's no wall high enough to keep out the risks that face us, and that it's led to a rethinking, solidarity between the young and the old in the most remarkable way, as the First and Second World War did. And so for me, the question is, are we in the First World War or Second World War? And I ask that because the First World War led, as we know, to a downward spiral of attempts at punishing the losers, a new Cold War between Europe and the old Germany and Japan, and of course, terrible policy mistakes, austerity, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and an even worse war. And that, for me, is what happens. The Second World War, by contrast, in the midst of that war, while literally the buildings of the civil servants were being bombed and they were fighting war on 5 different fronts, the leaders said, let's create a new world. And they wrote the Beveridge Commission, which created the welfare state, 1942. They wrote the Manifesto of the United Nations to create a world free of poverty and where people would live in harmony. They created the foundations of the Marshall Plan. And they created the foundations of Europe too. That was a different thing. And to me, that's the choice we face. It's not that let's welcome the end of globalization. We'll need to have a better globalization maybe in the future. It's let's use this opportunity to rethink everything and create a globalization that works for everyone, people and planet around the world.
Okay, Prabhat, do you want to answer his first question then? Do you want to unmute yourself? Can you hear me, Professor Patnaik? Yeah, he needs to.
Okay. Globalization in the realm of ideas, globalization in the realm of cooperation, in the promotion of the brotherhood among human beings. I'm all for it. But my point is that the globalized regime that we live under, in fact, what you find is that Modi in India is actually oppressing people, creating religious divides, but swears by globalization. Bolsonaro swears by globalization. Likewise, I'm sure, you take Turkey and so on. None of them have moved away from globalization, but on the other hand, they can be extremely ruthless domestically and have been. So they are two separate things. I'm opposed to the regime of globalization, which basically means free flows of commodities and finance. When I talk about finance, I'm not talking about the influence of finance on elections or in paying money and so on. All that was there even before. But what I have in mind is that if the economy is open to financial flows and the government does something that global finance does not like, for instance, raise the amount of taxation on wealth or on profits, then you have a huge outflow of finance, and it is that which prevents the government from doing it. So it is the structural constraints imposed by being caught in a world of globalized finance, not the fact of finance influencing elections on. That's important, but that was there even before. Coming to China, you see, China is one country which actually has not opened its economy to global financial flows, in the sense that if you are in China and suppose you have foreign portfolio investment coming in, foreigners come and invest, let us say, in financial assets in China. If they want to go out tomorrow, then they have to sell those assets to other foreigners, because of which you don't really have this enormous outflow of finance, which hurts other economies. So China really, in that sense, has not opened up to other to this kind of to global financial flows in that sense. The other question which you raised was about nutrition. Okay, let me say a few things about poverty. All the poverty estimates that we normally get from the World Bank are really national poverty estimates, which are suggested to the World Bank. The World Bank itself doesn't have any kind of poverty estimates. What it gets from India is the poverty line in India, official poverty line. What it gets from China is the official poverty line in China. It makes some kind of an average of them and says that is the poverty line for the world. Now, the point is all these official poverty lines are gross underestimates, because of which you actually find that there's a decline in poverty, which is why I quoted nutritional poverty. Now, if you take nutritional poverty, it's not just India. You take the world as a whole. Between 80 and 85, the per capita cereal production in the world was higher than it was in the quinquennium ending 2017-18. Now, obviously, the world is not importing cereals from anywhere else. Obviously, people's consumption has gone down. And if it has gone down, then there must have been an increase in nutritional poverty. I know that in the advanced countries, there is some health consciousness because of it is a voluntary reduction. But on the other hand, I think that is not enough to explain the kind of fall. So there is an increase in nutritional poverty. By the way, the Chinese one day decided to double their poverty line, because they themselves felt that the poverty estimates they were getting were really absurdly low. So I don't think one can really set too much store by the World Bank's poverty line. I want to make a point about trade, which was made by Will. You see, trade as a mechanism of development is something which I completely disagree with. Yes, in some countries it can be, because let's not forget that the entire colonial experience was one in which economies were shattered, deindustrialization was ushered in, all domestic production was shattered because of the free import of mechanized goods. Now, the point is that, that I believe that a country must have the right to protect its employment, the right to protect its livelihoods, and therefore should be able to actually curtail imports that are deindustrializing. As a matter of fact, I believe full employment is a far more important objective than simply having free trade. In fact, free trade can undermine your desire to have full employment, which was the case because then countries start doing beggar my neighbor policies and so on. On the question of inequalities, we talk about inequalities and we say, why can't we have government action against inequalities? You see, much of the third world is now in a position where there's a race to the bottom. They're competing against one another to attract foreign capital or to prevent capital from flowing out. India would like capital that is coming out of China before it moves to Vietnam so that you can have some industrialization. Now, in this race to the bottom, any country that actually decides to put a restraint, let us say, on inequality and so on is a country that would lose this kind of foreign investment coming in, which is why I would really like the state to have an autonomy, the government of a country to have an autonomy, in which case politics would become authentic, and of course then you can have progressive politics as well. And for that is very important to get out of this regime of hegemony of finance, which current globalization really is all about, in my view. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, some of the other panelists might want to respond to some of the things you said there, but Ian, you posed a question to Linda. Do you remember the question, Linda? Or...
I do, but that discussion between Prabhat and Will looks really interesting, so I'm going to keep my response short. I don't think I said, and I do apologize if I did, that it was a good thing or optimistic that globalization has ended before. I think what I was suggesting was something more like the consolations of history, in that if this feels like a period in which lots of things are under challenge, then we have been here before. But as Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So what I'm describing are the kind of the phases through history in which globalization has waned, and periods. And some of the terminology, I think, suggests that we just look at the modern period. The 1990s, with the doubling of the global labor force, with the integration of China, India, Eastern Europe, to 3 billion people, the Great Doubling is what it's called. That period has been described as a period of hyper-globalization or hyper-capitalism by Danny Dorling, one of our colleagues at Oxford, as well as by Thomas Piketty when I did his book talk recently. And I think even by the end of the 1990s, there was this sense that there was a lot of excess from the globalization of the 90s. And I think it is intertwined with the capitalist 80s free market ideology. So I think it's that combination of things that meant that even though we seem to have gone through another period of greater globalization in the 21st century, I think a lot of the backlash was already there. And then if we think back through history, we're very fortunate that what I've just described in the last few decades, at most we had a Cold War. Clearly there were episodes in which, it was war, it was, lots of different reasons. So for instance, if you think about the Long Depression, or the Great Depression in the 19th century, that came after the Panic of 1873, which then itself led to the rise of Marxism, actually, and trade unionism and a number of other things. And that culminated ultimately in some of the changes we saw in the early 20th century. So I hope that makes it just slightly clearer. But I think for me, this debate about globalization is a good thing, because the economic paradigm, as I say, has been under strain for some time. And again, through history, we see when it's a good opportunity to reform it. And I think, Ian, that's what you were getting at the, in your kind of final bit of your question, which is, we have to, nothing is ever fit for purpose for that long. So the creation of the welfare state capitalism, as I say, that was a reaction to a very long period in which there was a discontent with the capitalist system. Panic of 1873, unemployment appeared for the first time in the dictionary in the late 19th century. By the early 20th century, there was a real battle of ideas between Marxism and between people like Friedrich Hayek, Joseph Schumpeter. So these are the kinds of periods of debate. And I think we need to have a battle of ideas. So I think with that, I'm going to suggest that we'll continue that conversation with Prabhat, which seemed absolutely fascinating around trade.
But unmute myself. Oh, I'm not. Yeah. I mean, where do I begin? I mean, obviously, it is possible and has been possible for particular economies to develop autarkly. I mean, I think that autarky is obviously a policy option, and in the 19th century, I mean, the great kind of proponent of that was Friedrich List and his national system of political economy. But it's intriguing when you unpack Friedrich List's book. I'm sure you know it, Prabhat. But I mean, what was his recipe for kind of scaling up industry in German-speaking peoples when he wrote in 1833? Actually, it was to the absolutely sine qua non of his recipe, which worked, was to remove as many barriers to internal trade in Germany as possible. he wanted what we now call a single market or a customs union in Germany. And that is how German reunification proceeded in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, behind, yes, a tariff wall, but actually enlarging the trade possibilities within that. So that, you went from a world in which there were a multiplicity of tiny principalities to actually a grand trading area. Now, I mean, my view is that if you try to explain why Switzerland is rich and Afghanistan is poor, both landlocked countries surrounded by mountains, you quickly, you can't get far in, when you write your 10 paragraphs, somewhere in paragraph 3, 4, or 5 is going to be the fact that actually Switzerland stands at the kind of pivot of multiple trade routes in Europe, and actually, the fact that the great passes through the Alps between kind of Italy and German-speaking Europe, later through Switzerland, actually fundamental to the story of how it became what it's become. And I've been very influenced in my thinking by Braudel and his history of the Mediterranean, and the rise of the kind of Assyrians in Lebanon, and then the rise of the Egyptians, and the rise of the kind of Minoans, the Greeks, the Romans. I mean, the story is, and then ultimately, of course, the rise of kind of Muslim peoples and their invasion north into Spain and up through Turkey into Eurasia. What was that all about, and how did they have the capacities that they had? All about, they got better at being at fighting because they borrowed each other's ideas over how to arm themselves. It was trade-based. And it was trade-based because the Mediterranean was navigable so easily, which wasn't possible in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. So when you kind of think about what's taken place historically, I find it, in fact, you can't. I defy you as an economist to tell a story of global growth by country or by continent that is independent of trade relationships, and that there are maybe individual countries who tried autarky but screwed up. I would actually argue that the fall of Mao in 1976, the collapse of Maoism, the collapse of the Gang of Four who succeeded him, and the opening up to Deng Xiaoping, was actually because the Chinese experiment in autarky failed. And actually exposing itself to trade has been a really important reason for its growth over the last 40 years. And actually, you won't, if you go to the party schools in either Beijing or Shanghai, you won't find many people who dispute that. So although you're a Marxist economist, and although I absolutely agree with your, not entirely, but I do get your point about the hegemony of finance, and I've inveighed against that in my own books over the years. I think that you make a category error in actually trying to hook that up to condemning trade. That's my
So we were going to go through each speaker and give them an opportunity to pose a question to another member of the panel. But I understand if we did that, we'd be here all evening because this discussion is so nuanced and broad. Instead, I'm going to pose a couple of questions from our live viewers. We won't go on for much longer than 10 minutes because I don't want to keep the panelists here too long. But we've heard a lot about sort of the losers of the globalized world that's going to emerge from this pandemic. We haven't heard so much about the winners, and we have this brilliant question from someone who asks who will benefit the most from globalization after the coronavirus pandemic. If anyone has any initial thoughts, then just throw them out.
Who's benefited most from the global pandemic?
Yeah. So who will benefit the most?
I'm happy to come in on that.
Okay.
I think it's clear that globalization is increasing inequality dramatically within countries and between countries. And it's reinforcing particularly groups in countries, I think all of us, who can do our work online, who stay paid by our employers online, compared to people that have to go into work. So it's dramatically increasing certain categories of workers' incomes. It's dramatically, Jeff Bezos apparently is getting $11,000 a second richer as a result of this pandemic. That is because it's dramatically benefiting online, digital, retail, but not physical, certainly not hospitality, experiential. It's dramatically benefiting particularly those people who have been able to speculate in different ways on it. And of course, it's not only harmful, but it's killing, as we know from all the data, Black and Asian and ethnic group people at double or triple the rate that it's killing others. So poor people are not only poorer in terms of income, but also because the neighborhoods they live in, the conditions they live in, they're poorer health-wise. And of course, it's doing this globally. It's not only doing it within our countries, it's increasing vastly the differences between countries. We will see well over 100 million people pushed into desperate poverty by this. We will see tens of millions of people killed by starvation, many more people dying of starvation than die from the pandemic. And I believe that more than 40 countries, something like 100 countries, are going to need bailouts. And they are going to be at the mercy of the international financiers, and their growth prospects are even worse than they were before. So this pandemic is benefiting those that have, in particular areas and particular groups, much more than others. And the question is, as is the question on the streets of all of our cities in the Black Lives Matter protests, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to change this? This is not inevitable. This is not a course of history that's written. This is what is appearing to be the case, but we can change it. And I think that is the big challenge, is our governments up to it? Now, the rich governments have done an enormous amount in furloughing workers, in bailing out firms, particularly bigger firms. Poor countries cannot afford that. That's also time limited. But the question is, are we in a new world order where the old economic orthodoxies have been thrown out? We can have massive deficits. We can have very active governments. Governments can own much bigger parts of the economy. We can tax much more, and we can look after people not only in our own countries, but around the world. And that's what's been missing. International solidarity has been largely absent. And that's, of course, the biggest deficit, and will lead to the vast increases in inequality between countries.
Okay. Linda, you want to come in quickly?
I was actually going to suggest, why don't you take the next question? Was going to come in, but I think in the interest of time, why don't you pose the next question?
Yeah, it might be relevant to my next question, which I want to hear all of your thoughts on. So we've heard Prabhat, for example, spoke a lot about how increased intervention could be a possible solution to the increased poverty and inequality that will come out of this pandemic. One of our viewers, Guneet Malik, asked what's stopping the G20 nations from getting together to ban tax havens to increase revenue and reduce deficit. So Ian, you were just talking there about how there's a need for greater international solidarity to respond to sort of these problems. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on what are possible.
Well, I've been involved. I mean, I've been involved in that activity, and I've been trying to do it, but I think I don't want to hog the floor. So maybe give others. The basic reason is that there's a huge conflict of interest, and the US has sabotaged every attempt at the OECD. The OECD is trying to do this. The OECD's got the documents on the table. The US refused to sign it, and then you get this race to the bottom. Of course, a lot of countries benefit, but Monaco, Luxembourg, Cayman, we know who they are. They're very small, and they often sunny places for shady people. But it's going to take the big powers to stop it. And the US has to be in on that, because as long as the US isn't part of it, it won't happen.
Right. Linda?
I was just going to say, well, I think Ian's answered the question. I was just going to say something maybe broader about intervention. and sort of the opportunities. There are those who are winning from this pandemic, as Ian has already outlined. So I think the question it raises is it worsens inequality, and the solutions around inequality are one of the biggest hotly debated topics of our time. So what this, I think, pandemic has shown is the weak social safety nets, and even in advanced economies, rich countries, and the inequalities in terms of health access. There's a lot of things here, but what this pandemic has also shown is that when governments do want to intervene, as in the furlough schemes that we've discussed, or short time work, or beefing up, universal benefits or credit. I think that in and of itself is one facet of the change debate. So one of the policies, which I know gets a lot of interest, is universal basic income, and it's one of the ways in which, I think the pandemic has shown that we do have the fiscal capacity to do a lot more, perhaps, than we thought, when there is a clear, demonstrable, what are we using it for? And so to me, those are the kinds of things to just kind of stress. It's, those of us, who are fortunate and who can work, I think this really is a time to really think hard about rethinking fiscal policy and rethinking the ways in which this is added and worsened to inequality. So, and yes, we should tackle tax havens, but like I said, Ian's already answered that. So,
Professor Patnaik, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just would like to say that, that let's say I see around myself in India at this moment, hundreds of thousands of migrant workers literally walking hundreds of kilometers to get back home. So that you actually find that the lockdown, which is something which has made them suddenly incomeless, jobless, homeless. They were in cities doing various jobs, and suddenly they have lost everything, and they are just trying to migrate back, and in extremely difficult conditions. And the point is, therefore, the inequalities that it has actually generated are enormous. And what is more, it has also exposed the fact that during the period of globalization, the middle class did very well and developed a kind of contempt for the poor that did not exist during the anti-colonial struggle. So that, to my mind, has also been a contribution of the globalization we have experienced.
How interesting. How interesting. I mean, I just found that very. Do you mean the within India, the middle class have a disdain or a contempt even for kind of poorer classes and castes? Yes. In a way that wasn't there in the 1940s and 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, I think the anti-colonial struggle brought people together, while now in the last few decades, actually the middle class has done well out of this entire regime of globalization, while the poor have not, and therefore the differences have widened, and they have developed a kind of contempt for the poor, which is manifest in all these things that you find today.
I do think this point about it's impossible to construct solidaristic kind of institutions with the which involves substantial transfers of income from one class to another without some solidaristic values. And I think one of the most pernicious things of the last 30 years has been this growth, not only in India but actually in the West and the UK. I mean, the sense that the rich feel that somehow they've earned or deserve or merit their wealth, exactly. And they are contemptuous of those who aren't in the same position, and they want to educate themselves separately, live apart. You have a kind of new kind of, I mean, it's a kind of soft apartheid.
Yes.
Actually, you can. Your health, your education, your lived experience is entirely privatized in kind of private lagers, and you hold others in. If you're not in contempt, you have no regard for them. You can't feel and you've no desire to put your hand in your pocket and actually do anything about it. And here's the point I want to sign off on, really, is that I do think that the pandemic has been a reminder in the same way that pandemics were in the 19th century. I mean, you know, you could smell Preston, an industrializing city 40 miles south. You know, the middle class lived on the west of English cities because if you lived on the east, the smell and the fumes and the disease was so noxious that, you know, you got iller. And, you know, putting in sanitation, municipal socialism was actually driven by a middle class that recognized that it might want to declare independence from the poor, who it might hold in contempt. But unfortunately, if they got ill, they made you ill as well. And I think, you know, the thing about COVID is it's making us, it doesn't respect class, caste, or whatever. And it is reminding everybody that actually, you know, the public health is a universal asset, that no societal structure is possible without some kind of universal health system. That's right. And that's true not only, you know, nationally but internationally. Yes. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for what was such one of the best panels, I think, this term. So engaging, really fascinating, and I've learned so much. And hopefully the viewers. I apologize too for not getting around to all of the questions, but this panel just seemed to flow itself without need for my intervention. But thank you all. Thank you to Dr. Yueh, to Professor Golden, to Professor Patnaik, and to Will Hutton for what was an extraordinary discussion. Hope you all keep well, stay tuned in for our future videos, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and keep safe. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Thanks all of you.
That was brilliant. I'll let you guys go now, but thank you so much for keeping up with my email correspondences. And yeah.
And thanks to Prabhat for staying up till midnight in Delhi.
Yes, it's actually exactly midnight. Yes.
Exactly. Really well done.
All the very best.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.